is going to be talking about the mob and its influence in Hollywood. We'll be right back. Grab your popcorn and snacks. Find a comfy spot, take a seat or lie down, and let me transport you to a place of fantasy, ghost stories, ancient legends, odd creatures, alien encounters, and other magical topics. You may even decide to join the conversation. From faraway lands to your own backyard, with a small dash of pixie dust, turn out the lights and open your minds. The journey is about to begin. Good evening, everybody. How's everybody doing? I hope you said well. Make sure I got the right one running. Right. My name is Charlotte, and I'm going to be your host for the next hour. If I could just figure out which button I pushed. Okay, we're on the right button. Too many buttons. Never hook up too many buttons. Anyway, I'm going to be your host for the next hour. I'm also the owner of the California Haunts Paranormal Investigation Team. Based out of Sacramento, California. We are 45 strong up and down the state, which means if you think you have a paranormal need, we can get to you. It might take us a while. California is huge. A lot of people don't realize how large a state California actually is. But it may take us a couple days. I mean, we've not only got our oceans where, the whole California Beach Boys, California Girls thing, like Hawaii, when people think of us. But we also have a lot of farmland, a lot of desert, a lot of mountains, so it's got a little bit of everything. Excuse my old squeaky chair. There's nothing else I can do with it. I'm waiting on getting a new chair here the next month or so the squeaky will stop. Anyhow, if you want to find us, and it's easy to find us to help you out with your paranormal needs, just check us out on Facebook, California Haunts Paranormal Investigation Team, or California Haunts Paranormal Radio Show. Okay, just under California Haunts Radio. You can find us that way, or all the other social media platforms. There's Twitch and X and Twitter. Well, it used to be Twitch, and YouTube. Oh my God, our YouTube's huge, and TikTok. So just Google us in. We'll just pop right up for you. That being said, as we talk about social media, every social media place works just about the same way. So tonight, if you're watching from Facebook, Twitch, YouTube, or TikTok, remember, if you like what you see, if you like what you hear, please be sure to leave us a thumbs up or a heart. Tap that. If you're over on TikTok, tap that screen for hearts. Happy faces. Feel free to converse in the chat room. And if you haven't done so already on Facebook and you like what you see and hear, please hit that follow button. Same thing for all the other places. And then when you go over to our YouTube page, that's where it gets interesting because we have more than 900 videos sitting at YouTube. All of this show, all different topics. As you can see, even by tonight's topic, I don't like to stay primarily on paranormal stuff. I like to vary my topic. My real life job is a newspaper reporter and photographer. That's what I do for real. So I like to vary it with topics like tonight. So please, please check out our YouTube page. I'm starting to categorize all those 900 topics and make it easier for you guys to look stuff up because you'll find a lot of different things on there. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe. We're trying to reach that magic 1,000 number over there. We're getting closer and closer and closer. Watch hours are getting there. Everything's getting there, so it's getting real exciting on this end. So please feel free to do that. All right. Well, my guest tonight, Jeffrey Sussman. I hope I said his name correctly. You guys know how bad I am with people's names. Bad host. Anyway, this book he's written about the mob in Hollywood really was of interest to me because my father was really into reading these kind of stories. Hollywood Babylon, there was a original book for Hollywood Babylon, and there was a newer book that came out quite a few years ago, but there was a secondary book to it, and it was more of an updated book, and it talked about some mobsters in there. So I thought it would be great to bring Jeffrey on because I'm really into that stuff. Vegas mobsters. In fact, I saw Bugsy Siegel's wax figure in Las Vegas at Madame Tussauds, and the man had beautiful blue, give away everything else the man was involved in. He had these gorgeous blue eyes, just gorgeous, movie star eyes. But anyway, I'll let Jeffrey tell you about himself and how he got into this. Maybe it was similar to how I got into it. I don't know. Because I remember my dad having those books, and I would read them as a kid growing up. So that's how I got into this topic. And you'll be surprised how much the mob has influenced Hollywood. And I also have another question for him about a particular rock star who might have been not so much involved with the mob, but his manager might have been involved with the mob, causing some changes in his life. So we'll see if Jeffrey knows anything about that. If he doesn't, that's cool too. Let me bring Jeffrey on. Hello, sir.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Tell us about you.
Well, a lot of people have asked me why I got interested in writing books about the mob. And this is the fourth one that I've written about organized crime.
Mm-hmm.
It began when I was 13. I met an uncle of my father. He was an uncle by marriage. And uh, I learned from my father that this man had been a bootlegger during Prohibition, and that he met my father's aunt while smuggling booze across the Canadian border
Mm-hmm.
into New York. And one of his big competitors was a gangster named Dutch Schultz. And when Dutch Schultz was murdered in 1935, my father's uncle was indicted but never tried for that murder. So that was the first thing that sparked my interest in
Mm-hmm.
organized crime.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing was that uh, when I was a little bit older, I used to work for my father on Saturday mornings. He had a garment factory. He had two of them, and I used to. He was open half a day on Saturdays, and I would work for him from 9 in the morning till 1 in the afternoon. And my job was fairly menial. It was sweeping the floor and picking up scraps of garments that were then put into a barrel and sent to a mill for recycling. But every once in a while, I'd also have to carry large bolts of cloth up from the basement to the cutter's table where dresses were cut out from patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And one day I was coming up to the top of the stairs and I heard my father and another man yelling at each other. And it sounded very violent. And when I got to the top of the stairs, I saw my father and his fists were clenched. He had been an amateur boxer when he was a young man, and he
Mm-hmm.
looked like he was about to punch this man. And he pointed his finger at this man, and he said, "Get the effing out of here." And in response, the guy held up his forefinger and his thumb like a gun, and went, "We're going to get you, you son of a bitch."
Whoa.
And and driving home after he closed the factory that afternoon, I asked him what that was all about, and he said that was a gangster named Johnny Dio who worked for the Teamsters Union and also some illegal unions in the garment center.
Mm-hmm.
And he had tried to unionize my father's workers, and the workers voted against it because my father was a very progressive boss. He paid them very well, and not only that, this is unusual because this is in the late 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he gave them 90 days of health insurance, which they didn't have to pay for. And uh, I graduated from the eighth grade a couple of weeks after that. And when we came home, we found out that our house had been robbed and they had destroyed the kitchen. They turned over the refrigerator. They threw the contents of the refrigerator all over the kitchen. They smashed plates. They smashed cups, saucers, and glasses. It was a total mess. And I didn't learn until sometime after that that this was a message from the mob that you better go along with us or this is just the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother had two cousins uh, who were sort of mob connected. They had run an Italian grocery store in an Italian neighborhood in Queens, New York during the Depression. And they had taken turns going to law school. One would go one semester and the other would go to law school and they'd switch off. But they got
Mm-hmm.
to know, probably because of their customers, a number of people in the mob. And my father went to one of the brothers and asked if he could be of assistance in this. And he said, "Let me see what I can do." And he was able to negotiate a deal where my father wouldn't have to unionize his workers,
Mm-hmm.
but he would have to hire the trucking company. And my father died 2 years later of leukemia. Excuse me. And his partner was not a very tough guy, and it was hard for him to stand up against this mob-run trucking company,
Mm-hmm.
which kept increasing their rates, making them more and more onerous,
Mm-hmm.
until he had to give away. He started giving away pieces of the business to them, and eventually they had majority control of the business, and they were buying raw garments for dresses and bathrobes and blouses and so forth on credit. And when they could no longer buy this stuff on credit, uh, they decided to burn down the factory for the insurance money. Um, so anyway, that was the second thing that sparked my interest in organized crime. The third thing was that in 1981, I went through a very painful divorce, and I was depressed. And a friend of mine recommended a therapist
Mm-hmm.
who I saw for 2 or 3 years, and we became friends afterwards. And it turned out that his father controlled all the bookmaking in
Mm-hmm.
New York for Frank Costello, who was head of the mob in New York. He was head of the old Lucky Luciano crime family, and he was known as the prime minister of the underworld.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned a lot about him, and what he had gone through growing up.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so, he would tell me interesting stories, such as um, one day when he was in high school, his father and Frank Costello picked him up in a big Cadillac limousine, and they drove him up to Saratoga to the races, and they gave him $100 to bet, which he lost. And then another time, after he graduated from high school, he wanted to bring his prom date to the Copacabana, famous nightclub in New York. And
Mm-hmm.
Frank Costello was the owner of the nightclub. And he called Frank and asked him if he could get him in. And Frank said, "Sure, I'll get you in." And when he got there, they gave him a table right in front of the stage. And Frank Sinatra was performing that night. And when he asked for a check, he was told that everything had been on the house. There were no charges. And then he told me other stories, and I met people through him. He introduced me to a lot of people, and it was also interesting is that as a psychotherapist, he was treating a number of sons of mafia people who were very conflicted about whether to
Wow.
follow in their father's footsteps or go into a legitimate business. So those
Wow.
were the three things that sparked my interest. And so the first book I wrote about organized crime
Mm-hmm.
was called Big Apple Gangsters: The Rise and Decline of the Mob in New York. And through him, I got to meet some important people that I was able to interview. And I have a few friends who are retired detectives who are in organized crime strike forces, and they
Mm-hmm.
were able to introduce me to some people in the mob who were very interesting for me to interview. And then, because of my father's interest in boxing, I wrote a book after that called Boxing in the Mob: The Notorious History of the Sweet Science, about how organized crime controlled boxing. And that led me into doing a book called Sin City Gangsters: The Rise and Decline of the Mob in Las Vegas. And I got to interview a number of children and grandchildren of famous mobsters, as well as some uh, old retired mobsters.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned Bugsy Siegel earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Bugsy Siegel was a character that managed to come through all of this. He was in New York, he was in Las Vegas, he was in Hollywood. And so I kind of followed where he led me. And that's when I decided to write Tinseltown Gangsters: The Rise and Decline of the Mob in Hollywood. And it led me into all sorts of areas that I was unaware of,
Mm-hmm.
but I was able to do a tremendous amount of research and find out things that I hadn't known before and that most people don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I did the research and I wrote the book, and the book came out just a few weeks ago.
Mm-hmm. When you mentioned Vegas, and there was an unspoken cousin, distant cousin that I guess we had in my family, Mexican, unless he was half Italian or something I don't know about. Obviously not a made man. But my mother said that my uncles had told her that we had an open invitation to go to Vegas and they would put us up in a high roller suite when we went. And everything would be covered. And my mother never went because she always thought that this particular cousin was involved with the mob.
What year was that about?
Probably the late 70s,
Yeah,
early
well,
80s.
the mob was pretty much out of there by the 1980s.
Okay. Yeah.
The Chicago outfit, which owned four casinos, they were
Uh-huh.
the subject of the movie Casino. They were pretty much driven out
Okay.
by the end of the 1970s. So I mean, they were involved in ancillary businesses
Right.
and unions and stuff like that, but they didn't own any casinos after by the 1980s.
Yeah, it always bothered. The other thing I remember, my dad was born in 1926. He grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. And he would make me laugh because when he saw, well, even here, just because of the way he was brought up and around, and he saw guys from the mafia in Cleveland. But his big thing was every time a business burned out here, he'd say, "Oh, I didn't know those boys needed the money."
What there was a very famous gang called the Mayfield Road Gang from Cleveland, and there was a very famous gangster named Mo Dalitz, and
Mm-hmm.
Mo Dalitz was really Mr. Las Vegas. He built one of the first casinos out there, the Desert Inn,
Uh-huh.
and got money from the Teamster Central States Pension Fund, and he built many other casinos after that. And by the time he was an old man, he was legitimate. He built churches and synagogues and hospitals and schools and so forth. But he was one of the top mobsters in Las Vegas. He was not known very well outside of the state of Nevada, but he started out in Cleveland with his three other partners, and they were a big controlling force in Las Vegas for 30 years, and
Mm-hmm.
they probably had their uh, ownership stakes in at least a dozen other casinos.
Fascinating. Now, when we talk about the mob in Hollywood, what years are we talking about? I mean, I know, the whole thing, that story with Lana Turner, so obviously, it was during her time as well. But when did the mob decide it wanted a piece of Hollywood?
Well, initially Al Capone showed some interest in investing or getting control of some businesses in Hollywood,
Mm-hmm.
and he didn't do anything about it. But then Joseph Kennedy went out there in the 1920s, and he was hired to sell a company called FOB, and instead of selling it, he decided to buy it, and he borrowed money from his father-in-law and from the president of Filene's department store, but it wasn't enough. And he knew the people in the outfit, and he knew a lot of gangsters because he was a bootlegger and had been a partner of Frank Costello back in New York. So he went to the outfit in Chicago and he borrowed several $1 million from them, and he bought FOB and he turned it into a very successful film company. I mean, they produced a lot of schlock. They did a Western a week for $30,000, silent movie. But to his time in Hollywood, he became known as a very successful money manager.
Mm-hmm.
And he began having an affair with the famous movie star Gloria Swanson. And he lavished all kinds of expensive gifts on her: diamond necklaces, diamond bracelets, fur coats, cars, and so forth. And their affair went on for about 3 years until her accountant discovered that all the gifts that Joseph Kennedy was giving her, she had paid for. He took the money out of her accounts to buy her these gifts. She thought that he was buying them and giving them to her, but in fact, the money was coming out of her own accounts. So
Wow.
she broke off that relationship with Joseph Kennedy. But he was a very ambitious man, and he wanted to buy a chain of movie theaters called the Pantages Movie Theaters,
Mm-hmm.
which was started by a Greek immigrant named Alexander Pantages. And Kennedy made him an offer, but Pantages refused. So Kennedy made him a second offer, was refused again. He made him a third offer, and it was refused. So Kennedy was getting very frustrated, and he's not the kind of guy who takes no for an answer.
Mm-hmm.
So, because he was in the film business, aspiring actors and actresses and directors and screenwriters were always coming to him looking for jobs. And there was a woman named Eunice Pringle, who was an aspiring actress and also a prostitute.
Mm-hmm.
And she had a boyfriend who was an aspiring screenwriter and also a pimp. And he said to them, "I'll make a deal with you that I'll help to further your careers, but you have to do something for me. And what that amounted to is Eunice Pringle hid in a closet off the office of Alexander Pantages. And when he came to his office, she leapt out of the closet, she tore the top of her gown, and started screaming rape. And Pantages was arrested, he was tried, and he was sentenced to 50 years in prison. 50 years, which is amazing. Murderers don't get that much time. And he hired an attorney named Jerry Geisler, who represented a lot of mobsters in Los Angeles and had been Bugsy Siegel's lawyer. And Geisler was able to prove that there was a conspiracy to convict Pantages, and he went to the Court of Appeals in California, and they reversed the conviction, and he was released after 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
But uh, Geisler wanted to get a deposition from Eunice Pringle, and the day before the deposition, she was poisoned, and she died, and no one was arrested, no one was tried, nothing happened. So you can imagine who had her poisoned
Absolutely.
and why. So when the outfit saw how much money um, could be made in Hollywood based on what Joe Kennedy did,
Mm-hmm.
uh, the outfit in Chicago and the New York mobsters, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Lucky Luciano, they sent Bugsy Siegel out to Los Angeles, initially to control the racing wire, which all bookies had to subscribe to in order to get the race results. But when he was out there, he was a handsome man, he was well dressed, he was well spoken. He had a good friend, George Raft, whom he had known back in New York. Raft had been an aspiring gangster when he was a young man, and but he introduced Bugsy to a lot of famous movie stars and directors, and Bugsy loved socializing with these people. And he even thought of becoming a movie star himself. And he had an audition tape made of himself portraying the same role that George Raft played in a movie called Manpower. But Bugsy, as self-confident as he had a very thin ego, and he wouldn't show this audition tape or film to anyone because he was worried he'd be rejected. So it never got shown around. But he would have parties to which the creme de la creme of Hollywood society would come. And because he had such a fearsome reputation, he would ask to borrow money from them, $50,000 here, $100,000 there. And people were frightened of saying no to him. So he was able to borrow hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then he wouldn't pay it back. And these people were too frightened to ask him for the money back because they thought they'd get killed. And while he was out there, he took control of the Screen Extras Union. And he used that as a means of extorting the movie studios. So he would say to them, you pay me $100,000, you pay me $50,000, and I won't have the extras go on strike. Because if the extras go on strike and you're making a big budget movie, it's all going to grind to a halt.
Mm-hmm.
So he was able to extort all this money from them. And he continued doing it until he went out to Las Vegas and started skimming money from his partners, and they had him killed. But he was working with another gangster named Mickey Cohen, who grew up in a poor Jewish neighborhood in Los Angeles. And when he was 9 years old, he wanted to be a gangster. And he and a group of similarly aged pals went with baseball bats to hold up a movie theater on Sunset Boulevard. And Mickey threatened the ticket taker that if she didn't hand over all the money from sale of tickets that day, that he was going to bash in her head with a baseball bat. And she was terrified, so she handed him all the money.
Mm-hmm.
Mickey then went on to become a professional boxer, and I think he had 10 bouts. He lost 5 and won 5. And then he moved on to Chicago, and he became a full-time thief there. But he was such a brazen thief that the outfit sent him back to Los Angeles. And they said, you're going to work for Bugsy Siegel. You're going to be his bag man there. So all the money that Bugsy was extorting from the movie studios, he would send Mickey Cohen to collect it, so that not to ruin uh, Bugsy's social reputation with a lot of these people.
Mm-hmm.
But then after Bugsy was killed, Mickey took over his operations in Los Angeles, and he did a few things that Bugsy hadn't done. One, he hired some private detectives to find out which movie stars were having adulterous affairs, who was gay, who was lesbian, and he started a scandal sheet called Hollywood Nightlife. And his partner in this was a man named Hank Sanacola, who was Frank Sinatra's manager.
Wow.
And and they would blackmail these people. They would say to them, "Look, we're going to, let the world know what you're up to, unless you take out a full page ad plus pay us X number of dollars." And they blackmailed Robert Mitchum because he was soliciting prostitutes and taking drugs. They blackmailed Joan Crawford because prior to the beginning of her movie career, she had made two pornographic movies, which MGM had spent a lot of money to suppress. And they even blackmailed Frank Sinatra, even though his partner, his manager, was a partner in this. And they did that because he was having an affair with Ava Gardner at the time, but he was married to his first wife, Nancy Sinatra, and he didn't want anyone to know about it. So he took out a full page ad. But in addition to doing that, um, Mickey Cohn also made movies of of using models that looked like famous actors and actresses, and they were pornographic movies. And he would say, "I'm going to show this movie unless you pay me, and people are going to think it's really you, and and uh, and not some model." And he was a very close friend, a guy who worked for him, a gangster named Johnny Stompanato, who was having an affair with Lana Turner. He was like a professional gigolo, and he had affairs with a lot of movie stars, including Ava Gardner. And at one point, Frank Sinatra went to Mickey Cohn and asked him to please ask Johnny Stompanato to break off his relationship with Ava Gardner. And Mickey Cohn did that, and Johnny Stompanato broke it off. But it ruined Frank Sinatra's reputation with mobsters because he was frightened of confronting Johnny Stompanato on his own, and so they kept saying, basically that Frank Sinatra's a wimp. He wouldn't stand up for his relationship with Ava Gardner.
Mm-hmm.
But regarding Johnny Stompanato and Lana Turner, um, she killed Johnny Stompanato, with whom she was having an affair. And Jerry Geisler, Bugsy's old criminal defense lawyer, became Lana Turner's lawyer and convinced Lana Turner's daughter to take the blame for the murder. And so they put together a scenario in which she said that she heard Johnny and her mother fighting or arguing, and she had a knife in her hand, and she opened the bedroom door, and Johnny Stompanato ran into her, and the knife went into his stomach and killed him. However, the pathologist said that he was stabbed more than 20 times, and you couldn't find any blood on the floor where they had dragged Johnny Stompanato's body, but the bed where he was stabbed was covered with blood. So Mickey Cohn broke into Johnny Stompanato's house and stole all of Lana Turner's love letters to Johnny Stompanato to prove that she loved him and wanted to have an ongoing relationship with him, even though at her trial she said that she was trying to break off the relationship. She didn't love him, and that he started beating her up, and that's when her daughter came and protected her. And Mickey Cohn went way out of his way to try to prove that this was a fallacious story and that Lana Turner had really killed Johnny Stompanato. And certainly the pathologist's report verifies that.
I find that story interesting. Like you say that that you say that Lana Turner did the actual murder because, like you said, it was a cover up. And for years, everybody thought her daughter had done it. I mean,
Right.
seriously, they really did.
I know. And it's amazing, that the daughter would have to live with that, even though she didn't do it. that must have been a terrible psychological burden to
Mm-hmm,
live with the
mm-hmm,
fact that the world thinks that you murdered somebody that whom you didn't murder.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, when you talk about Frank Sinatra and his manager being involved with the mob, I had also heard, and it's just a rumor, Colonel Tom Parker had also been involved with the mob through his connections in Las Vegas, and that's why Elvis ended up going in the. It's just all involved. Elvis ended up going in the army because he was trying to just keep things going without getting taken out.
No, Parker was not really involved with the mob. Parker was an obsessive gambler,
Okay.
and he made a deal with the casinos in which uh, Elvis was not getting paid nearly as much as he should have been paid.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is because they let uh, Colonel Parker gamble and not
Mm-hmm.
pay off a lot of his debts, and they gave him a suite and all expenses paid, and he could live like a king as long as they didn't have to pay Elvis the amount of money that they would normally have had to pay him.
Okay. Okay. I wondered about that connection. So getting back into the 1930s, 1940s Hollywood with these mobsters in there. Like you say, he had taken out all those loans, and then he was holding stuff over their heads. Was it ever a thing of investment for the mob too to be invested in certain movies that they wanted to see out?
Well, the mob was very heavily invested in Columbia Pictures when
Mm-hmm,
Harry Cohn was president of that. Harry
mm-hmm,
Cohn had started a small film company with his brother and another man in New York. And as it became more successful, he wanted to buy them out.
mm-hmm.
And he didn't have enough money to buy them out, so he borrowed money from the mob to buy them out. And then he opened Columbia Pictures in
Okay.
Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
And one of his investors was a man named Longy Zwillman, who was known as the Al Capone of New Jersey. And Longy Zwillman's girlfriend was Jean Harlow. And Longy Zwillman gave Harry Cohn, the president of Columbia, uh, $500,000 in exchange for $500,000 worth of stock. And he insisted that Jean Harlow star in a number of movies,
Okay.
which she did. Now, you know, and also Frank Costello was heavily involved in Columbia Pictures, and
Mm-hmm.
when the outfit earlier was extorting money from all the major movie studios to avoid strikes,
Mm-hmm.
Columbia Pictures was really the only one that wasn't extorted because of Harry Cohn's relationship
Mm-hmm.
with the mob. But there's that famous scene in The Godfather where the horse's head is cut off and put in the bed,
Right.
and
Right.
and so forth. Nothing like that ever really happened. What
Mm-hmm.
happened is that uh, Frank Sinatra's career was in the dumps,
Mm-hmm.
and he knew that if he could get the part in the movie From Here to Eternity, it would revive his career. And his godfather in New Jersey was named Willie Moretti, who was also a partner of Lungi Swillman. And Willie Moretti got Sinatra's career going. And when the mafia gets your career going, they don't do it as a favor. They expect something in return, and they owned him. And Frank called Willie Moretti and said, I need to get this picture. I need to get a part in this picture to save my career. Is there anything you can do to help me? And he said, let me call my cousin, his cousin Frank Costello. And he called Costello, and Costello said, let me see what I can do. And he called Harry Cohn, and he said, I'd like to get Frank this part in the movie. It'll save his career. And Harry Cohn said, well, I wanted Eli Wallach in this role, but he's in a Broadway play, a Tennessee Williams play, and he doesn't want to give up the role. So I'll audition Frank, and if
Mm-hmm.
Frank, passes the audition, I'll cast him in the movie. And that's what happened. It was nothing dramatic, about
Right.
coming to blows with the mob and cutting off horses' heads and all of that. It was, a mobster doing a favor for a mobster, in effect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But Harry Cohn was a very, very abusive, hated man in Hollywood. He was also probably the inventor of the casting couch. So any woman who wanted to star in a Harry Cohn Columbia Pictures movie in the 40s and 50s would have to sleep with Harry Cohn. And there were a few who avoided it, but most of them succumbed to him, and that's how they got their parts. So he was always trying to mold a big star. And in the 1950s, the woman that he chose to mold into a big, sexy star was Kim Novak. And at the time, she was having an affair with Sammy Davis Jr. And Harry Cohn was very worried about this because this is the 1950s and there's a lot of prejudice against blacks in the South. And
Mm-hmm.
he's worried that if it gets out that Kim Novak is involved with a black man,
Mm-hmm.
uh, audiences in the South are going to boycott her movies. So he went to uh, Kim Novak and asked her to break up the relationship, and she wouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
So he sent Mickey Cohn to see Sammy Davis. And
Mm-hmm.
he said to Sammy, Harry's going to take out a contract on your life if you don't break up with Kim Novak. He didn't believe it, so he didn't do anything. So the next thing was Harry Cohn actually sends two hitmen to see Sammy Davis Jr. in his dressing room. And I'm not going to use the exact language that they used, but I'll paraphrase what they said. Um, they said one of them said to Sammy, he said, "Look, you're a one-eyed black Jew. And if you don't
Wow.
break up with Kim Novak, you're going to be a blind black Jew. And not only that, you have 48 hours to marry a black woman." And Sammy did exactly what they were told. He broke up with Kim Novak, and he found a black lounge singer in Las Vegas. He married her. He paid her $25,000, and then gave her another $10,000 for her wardrobe. The
Mm-hmm.
marriage lasted only for a few months because obviously it wasn't a marriage of love,
Mm-hmm.
and it ended. But Harry Cohn was so nasty and abusive to the people who worked for him that they absolutely hated him. And when he died, 2,000 people showed up at his funeral on the Columbia Pictures movie lot. And a reporter, and the comedian Red Skelton was there, and a reporter said to Red Skelton, he said, "This man was so hated. Why did 2,000 people come to his funeral?" And Red Skelton paused for a moment and he said, "Look, when you give people what they want, they're going to show up." In other
Mm-hmm.
words, they were so happy that he was dead. And then the reporter went to the rabbi who delivered the eulogy at
Mm-hmm.
Harry Cohn's funeral. And he said to him, "Could you just say one or two words of something that's nice about Harry Cohn?" And the rabbi looked up at the sky, looked down at his feet, then looked at the reporter and he said, "He's dead." That's the
Wow.
nicest thing I can say about him.
Wow. Now, one of these guys was shot sitting in their living room, correct?
That was Bugsy Siegel.
Dr. Seal, that's what I thought, yeah. How did
Yeah.
that go down, or the details on that? Do
Excuse
you know?
me?
Do you
What?
have do you have any details on that? How did that go down?
Uh, what happened is Bugsy and his secret wife, uh, Virginia Hill,
Mm-hmm.
were skimming a ton of money from the building of the Flamingo Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas.
Mm-hmm.
And his mob partners, he'd known these guys since they were teenagers: Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Joey Adonis,
Mm-hmm.
said, "You've got to pay back the money." He said, "We know you've been skimming,
Mm-hmm.
but we'll forget about it if you just pay it back." And he never paid back any money that he stole. It wasn't in his nature, and he refused to pay it back. So they had him killed. Now, in the 1930s,
Mm-hmm.
Bugsy Siegel was a member of Murder Incorporated, which had evolved out of a gang that he and Meyer Lansky started uh, earlier than that. And Bugsy's partner in Murder Incorporated was a man named Frankie Carbo, who later went on to control boxing in the United States. But
Mm-hmm.
he and Carbo were committed a lot of murders together. And so in the mob, they have this kind of perverse way of doing things where they'll hire someone to kill you who is known as your friend
Mm-hmm.
or someone you've worked with before.
Mm-hmm.
And so a man named Ralph Natali, who used to be head of the Philadelphia mob, said that everyone in the mob knew that Frankie Carbo killed Bugsy Siegel, and because initially they thought he might have to get close to him and
Mm-hmm.
kill him, and instead He just hung up. He went to the outside of Bugsy's house and could see Bugsy through the window and used a carbine to fire several shots into Bugsy, and that killed him.
Interesting. Now, when you talk about the fear that people had, of the mob being there, and then you look at the different starlets that were involved with these guys, were they involved because they truly liked them, or were they involved because it was just fear? I mean, that was the deal. Like with Lana
Well,
Turner.
well, they admired them. It was very interesting because the wife of the comedian Phil Silvers
Hmm.
said that Phil Silvers and Frank Sinatra used to eat at, I forgot, maybe it was the Brown Derby, famous Hollywood restaurant in the 1930s and 40s. And when Bugsy Siegel would walk in, they would both stand up because they admired him so much, and they'd say, "Good evening, Mr. Siegel." And as he walked past and just nodded at them. And then she went on to say that the most admired people in Hollywood were not the movie stars, but the gangsters. She said they were like royalty, that all the movie stars just loved them, and they loved being around them. The only movie star who objected to Bugsy Siegel and to going to one of Bugsy Siegel's famous Christmas parties was the actor Jimmy Stewart, and he tried to dissuade other movie stars from going to Bugsy's Christmas party. And Bugsy confronted Jimmy Stewart and said, you can't do this. And George Raft was there, and then Bugsy came on pretty strong to Jimmy Stewart, and Jimmy Stewart said to him, "Take your best shot at me." And Frank and George Raft said to Jimmy Stewart, he said, "If Bugsy takes his best shot at you, you're dead. Don't even say that.
Right.
You'll regret it." And so, but that was the only movie star that I could come across who had any resistance to Bugsy Siegel. But they loved him. And so, for example, when James Cagney was made head of the Screen Actors Guild, the mob wanted him to do certain things for them, and he refused to do it. So they put out a contract on Cagney's life. And Cagney was a friend of George Raft. So he asked George if there was anything he could do for him. And George Raft called the outfit in Chicago and asked if they would please rescind the contract on Jimmy Cagney's life. And they did. And for the rest of his life, Jimmy Cagney was extremely grateful to George Raft. And years later, he said that George Raft was really the only tough guy in of all the movie actors. That all these actors who played at being tough guys, like Jimmy Cagney and Humphrey Bogart
Right.
and so forth,
Right.
they weren't tough guys at all. They pretended to be tough guys, and maybe some of them thought of themselves as tough guys because they believed the parts that they played. But he said the only really tough guy of all the movie actors was George Raft. And he associated with gangsters. He loved gangsters. He said he loved gangsters more than anyone. And when Eddie Fisher asked Frank Sinatra, uh, would he rather be a gangster or a movie star? Oh, no, he said, would you rather be the Godfather or the President of the United States? And he said, I'd rather be the Godfather, hands down. He's much more powerful than the president.
Now, you spoke earlier about doing the research for this Hollywood book. Was it difficult to get this information?
No, no. I mean, it's amazing what you can find on the internet. And also, I have a friend who's a reference librarian who was able to dig up all sorts of things for me, old newspaper and magazine articles, and you can go back. Especially if you're willing to pay for it, you can go back and you can find fascinating news stories from the 1930s and 40s, especially in newspapers that are no longer around. But you can find them. And also, there are a lot of criminal reports. So, for example, the FBI has a 1,400-page file on Frank Sinatra. It's the longest FBI file of any celebrity. It's extraordinary.
It must have been an eye opener, though. Some of the stuff. Once you started digging, because it's like I do that all the time for my, for my newspaper work. You start
Right.
digging around, and it ends up being this deep rabbit hole. So it must have been
Exactly.
interesting if one thing led to another as you were doing this research.
Yeah, the hole gets wider and wider and deeper,
Uh-huh.
and at some point you have to say that's enough. I can't go any further because I can only write so much,
Uh-huh.
and so you wind up stopping. But
Uh-huh.
I brought it all the way up to the present, to the mob's control of the pornographic film industry, to Robert Evans and the making of the Cotton Club,
Uh-huh.
and the murder of Robert Evans's partner in that, and it was all fascinating to me.
Uh-huh. Well, that brings me to my next question too. Is there a lot of mob influence in movies now, as opposed to back then?
The influence then was really through the control of the unions. Well, I
Okay.
didn't mention a man earlier. The outfit had sent three men to Hollywood: Willie Bioff, George Brown, and Johnny Roselli.
Uh-huh.
They controlled the Stagehands Union and a number of other unions, plus
Uh-huh.
the Teamsters Union.
Uh-huh.
And like Bugsy, they extorted the movie studios $100,000 a month not to have strikes. And
Wow.
and and Willie Bioff was the tough guy who intimidated them. George Brown was the figurehead president of the union, and Johnny Roselli, who was like Bugsy Siegel, he was very charming, very well dressed, very well
Uh-huh.
spoken. He was the bagman who collected the money for them, and it wasn't. This went on for a number of years. They collected millions of dollars until the FBI, excuse me, finally caught up with them, and they were all sent to prison for 10 years. Except Willie Bioff made a deal with the feds that he would provide information against his cohorts if he could get a reduced sentence, which he
Uh-huh.
did. And he only served 3 years in prison. And so the mob knew that he had betrayed them. And he moved to Phoenix, Arizona, and he changed his name to Willie Nelson, of all names. And and he became a very good friend of Senator Barry Goldwater, and went
Uh-huh.
into business with Barry Goldwater's nephew. And Barry Goldwater had a pilot's license and a private plane, and he used to fly Willie B off to Las Vegas whenever Willie wanted to go and gamble. And Willie
Uh-huh.
was an obsessive gambler. Las Vegas was not the place he should have gone to because there were so many mobsters there, and they recognized him, and they put out a contract on his life for betraying his pals. And he went back to Phoenix, and one day he kissed his wife goodbye in the morning. He got into his pickup truck, he turned the ignition, and he blew himself into 1,000 pieces.
Oh.
And so to answer your other question, uh, that was sort of the end of the mob extorting the movie studios by controlling all the unions.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Uh-huh.
but there were a lot of companies that they had invested in, and there are a lot of hedge funds and wealth management companies and other kind
Uh-huh.
of investment firms that to this day, to continue to invest in movies
Uh-huh.
because the return on a movie can be fantastic. Especially, somebody said the most creative people in Hollywood are the accountants,
Uh-huh.
uh, because they can prove that the most profitable movie in the world uh, has lost money, and that's a perfect vehicle for the mob. If you could invest $1 million and walk away with $25 million in expense money, and the movie loses money, that's
Uh-huh.
terrific. You don't pay taxes, and you
Right.
get 25 times your original investment back.
Right.
It's a fantastic deal.
Right. When you talk about Bugsy Siegel, giving parties and things like that, were there ever any times that these guys were actually on the studio lots, you know, making sure things were going their way or anything like that with these, with the films?
It was funny because during the making of the Cotton Club,
Uh-huh.
there were tremendous cost overruns and so forth, and the mob had invested a lot of money in making sure that movie came to completion.
Uh-huh.
And so there was a gangster named Joey Cusimano who sat on the set of the Cotton Club every day and
Uh-huh.
made sure that there were no cost overruns, that everything stuck to the schedule, so that everyone who invested in the money in the movie would get their money back. And he was, I think he became legitimate afterwards and went into the movie business. But at the time, uh, people on the set were frightened of him, and he was an intimidating presence.
Wasn't there a particular starlet who ended up dying in their garage?
Yeah, that was uh, what was her name? I'll tell you 1 second. Um, she did, and it was an accidental death. A lot of people said she was murdered, but she wasn't
Right,
murdered. Um,
right.
and she was known as the Ice Cream Blonde.
Mm-hmm.
Her name was Thelma Todd.
Albaton, that's it, hot toddy.
Yeah, and people said that Lucky Luciano was came to Los Angeles and had her killed. Lucky
Mm-hmm.
Luciano never went west of Hot Springs, Arkansas. He was never in Los Angeles. It was true the mob wanted to use her restaurant, turn it into a
Right.
second floor into a gambling casino, and she didn't want them to do that. But there were plenty of gambling casinos all over the place, and there was
Mm-hmm.
one just up the road on Sunset Boulevard. Um, they didn't need to kill it; they didn't need it; they just wanted it. But she she got drunk, and she couldn't get home. And it was she was cold, and,
Mm-hmm.
and she went into her garage and fell asleep in the car with the motor running, and she wound up asphyxiating herself. And but for a number of years, uh, people said that she had been murdered by organized crime because
Mm-hmm.
she wouldn't open a casino for them. It's been proven beyond a doubt that she wasn't murdered, that
It's
it was
good.
an accidental death.
It's good to clear that stuff up. You know,
Yeah, it
because
is.
for years and years, people thought that she had been murdered by
I know.
taken out by the mob. How
Right,
much
exactly.
involvement do you think the mob has in Hollywood now?
Excuse me.
How much involvement do you think the mob has in Hollywood nowadays?
I think, as I said, that through various kinds of finance companies,
Uh huh.
they can still finance movies and make a significant profit, an untaxed profit from them. It's almost irresistible for them.
Right. And also, I would think that some of these producers that want to do these movies and they can't quite get the funding might. It's kind of scary to think, but the funding has to come from somewhere.
Well, that's what happened with Robert Evans in the Cotton Club.
Mm-hmm.
That he had a cocaine problem. He lost his position at Paramount Studios. He went out and became an independent producer. He produced one flop after another. He
Mm-hmm.
met a big drug dealer from Los Angeles, from South Florida, who moved to Los Angeles, named Laney Jacobs, who
Mm-hmm.
wanted to become a producer. And she said she had all this money from the sale of drugs that she could invest. And she introduced him to a man named Roy Radin, uh, who produced vaudeville shows all over the country and made millions. And he actually owned the Cotton Club property, and suggested to Robert Evans that they become partners and produce this movie, and Radin would be able to put up all the money for it because uh, Evans had tried all kinds of places to get money from, Arab sheiks and wealthy arms dealers and so forth. He
Mm-hmm.
couldn't raise any money, and Reagan came along and saved him. But the two of them also pushed Laney Jacobs out of the picture, and
Mm-hmm.
and so Reagan got killed, and Laney Jacobs is serving life in prison, I think, right now.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, if you're having a hard time raising money, you may go to the mob to get the money,
Right.
or to a front company for the mob,
Mm-hmm.
some investment or stock company that they control.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Who do you think, out of all those years in Hollywood, because you talked about, Bugsy Siegel and the other gentleman that owned Columbia Pictures, who do you think was the most prominent mobster?
Um, well, at different points, um,
Mm-hmm.
probably the most colorful of the mobsters was Mickey Cohen.
Okay.
And he, in the 1950s, he was a publicity hound. And in the
Mm-hmm.
1950s, he would appear on all kinds of television talk shows all across the country. I remember when I
Wow.
was a kid seeing him on a local channel here that had a local talk show, and he
Mm-hmm.
would appear. Uh, he was a little guy. He was only 5'5", and he had girlfriends who were either strippers or porno actresses who were at least a foot taller than he was, or they
Mm-hmm.
seemed a foot taller, and they had the big blonde hair and
Mm-hmm.
the sexy gowns and so forth, and they would be on these. He would take them on talk shows, uh, And he was very funny. He was a very entertaining character. And I remember Mike Wallace once interviewing him, and he said, "Is it true that you've killed people?" And he said, "Yeah, I've killed about 11 people." And he said, "But you should know that I only killed people who deserved it. I didn't kill anybody who didn't deserve to be killed." He was very funny. He would admit these things and say outlandish things, and people, sucked it up. They loved it.
Well, it's just nonchalant for him because that's what he did for a living.
Exactly.
You know, I
Exactly.
get up in the morning, I took somebody out, boom, I went home and had breakfast.
Exactly. That's what he
That's
was
how they
like.
did it. Now, how
Yeah.
much control? And these guys, a lot of these mafia guys originated out of New York. So how much control? Because like you hear about Cohen, you hear about Bugsy Siegel. How much control did New York have over them, or did they not?
Well, Bugsy Siegel was part of the New York mob,
Okay, that's what I thought.
so
Yeah.
he was sort of like an emissary of
Mhm.
theirs.
Mhm.
The outfit had a lot of control over Mickey Cohen,
Mhm.
um, there was a local mafia family called the Dragna mafia family,
Mhm.
run by a man named Jack Dragna, but it was
Mhm.
so inept that mobsters and the police referred to it as the Mickey Mouse Mafia, and they were constantly going to war with Mickey Cohen. At one point, they tried to kill Mickey Cohen about 10 times and failed every time. And one time, they put a bomb under his bedroom. He and his wife used to sleep in separate bedrooms, but one night he was sleeping in bed with his wife, and Jack Dragner's people put a bomb under his bedroom
That's-
and blew up the bedroom. But Mickey Cohen emerged unscathed, and he ran out of the house in his silk monogrammed pajamas, saying, "Who the hell tried to blow up my house? I'm going to find out who did this, and I'm going to get them." Um, and and they were always trying to kill him, and they never succeeded. It was extraordinary.
Mhm. See, I find this all fascinating. Because you look at the reality of it as opposed to say the movie The Godfather, or some of those movies that have come out, and the reality is slightly different from what they actually show in the movies. Like you mentioned, The Horse's Head.
Right. So, years ago, I had an opportunity to speak with Mario Puzo, who wrote The Godfather, and I
Mm-hmm.
asked him if you could just say one sentence describing The Godfather, what would you say? And he said, "It's a fairy tale for adults," and just about nothing in there ever really happened, but
Mm-hmm.
people love it. They find it very entertaining.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of entertaining, what do you think of the book Mafia Princess?
I haven't read it. I'm sorry.
Have not read it? It's an
No.
interesting book, yeah, because it's essentially based on that movie that they made about the guy that was almost a made man, and he had been involved with the Lufthansa heist and all that, and then he went and he had to do with the witness protection with the FBI
Oh,
and
oh, Henry Hill.
Henry Hill, and it's the daughter that writes it, that
Yeah,
wrote the
yeah,
book and writes
yeah,
about
yeah.
I mean
Oh, Henry Hill's daughter wrote it.
yeah,
Oh, I didn't realize that. I
yeah,
have to read that. But what's interesting about that is none of those guys were in the mafia. They were just street thugs who paid tribute to the mafia.
okay,
And not only that, none of the money, the guys who went to prison on
mm-hmm.
Henry Hill's testimony, none of them went to prison for the Lufthansa heist.
Okay,
Uh, Jimmy Burke, who was the character, who was Jimmy Conway, the Robert De
mm-hmm.
Niro character in the
Mm-hmm.
movie, he went to prison for fixing a Boston College basketball game.
Mm-hmm.
And the other character, who was a mafia figure,
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, who, they called him Cicero, I think. He went to prison for associating
Mm-hmm.
with mobsters while he was out on parole. Um, and there's a lot in that movie, Goodfellas, that's just not true.
Okay.
Lot of things are made up. Um, I mean, a lot of things in the movie are true, but certainly a lot of things are fictionalized and made more interesting.
Well, but the majority of those movies are like that. It's for entertainment. But
Exactly,
I mean, really, if they told the truth on some of this stuff, it would be boring as hell. It's like just like the Ghost Hunting shows. They've got to put evidence out every time, whether or not they have evidence or not, because who's going to watch it?
exactly. So when I was writing my Las Vegas book,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that I discovered, which you don't see in the movie Casino,
Mm-hmm.
was that Lefty Rosenthal, also the character that became Ace Rothstein, in the
Uh-huh.
movie, he and his wife were FBI informants, and that's why the mob tried to kill them. And that's never mentioned or made clear in the movie that these two tried to protect themselves from ever getting arrested by informing against their friends
Uh-huh.
in the mob, and the mob discovered it or suspected it, and that's why they planted a bomb in Lefty's car.
Hmm. Now here's a question for you. One of the last questions tonight. Um, do you have any fear? Because you know, here you're writing these books about the mobs. So do you have any fear of anybody coming at you because you're writing all this stuff out?
No, I don't think so because I'm not making fun of anybody.
Uh-huh.
I'm not criticizing them. I'm just doing what a reporter would do in effect.
Uh-huh.
And reporters who have reported on the mob for years and years.
Right.
Um, the mob never went after them.
Uh-huh.
If you're holding someone up to ridicule or something, and you're going to make them angry by doing that, then there might be something to worry about. But if all you're doing is just reporting on what
Uh-huh.
you find out, and basically, if you dig uh, into this information, at some point or another, all of this stuff was public, but
Right.
it's been buried. And,
Uh-huh.
and so all you're doing is basically digging it up and finding things that people generally don't know about. They may have known about it in the
Uh-huh.
1920s, the 30s, and the 40s, but they've forgotten about it.
Uh-huh.
It's all there.
Uh-huh. Well, I can see that because my career as a crime court reporter, I've had to write stories about the KKK. When there's ever
Right,
been a problem. Or the big drug cartels in these cities I'm working at. So
right.
I've never had any problems with it. Last question, and you might like this. You're on the strip in Las Vegas, and you've got your books, and there's other guys that have similar books. How do you get people to read your books?
um, by giving a lot of talks
Uh-huh.
and by letting people know that I have information in my books that other people don't have. So, for example, Nick Pileggi, who wrote
Uh-huh.
Casino,
Right.
he gave me an endorsement to my Las Vegas book, and he said that he learned things about Las Vegas that he never knew before. And here's a man who wrote you know, the definitive gangster movie about Las Vegas. And he
Uh-huh.
learned things from my book that he didn't know before. So I hope that, that's why people want to read my books because they're going to find things that they're not going to find anyplace else.
Absolutely. What's next for you?
I want to do a book about the early days of the music business and how the mob got involved in that.
That could be cool. Very cool. How can people
Yeah.
find you, sir?
They can go to my authors page on Amazon.com. They put in
Uh-huh.
my name, and they'll see all the books I wrote, and they'll also see a brief biography of me.
All right, fair enough. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate
My
it.
pleasure.
I
I
enjoyed
enjoyed the
it,
interview.
and I
You're
would
a
love
good
to get.
interviewer.
Thank you. I would love to get you on a later time to even talk more about this or your next project.
Very good. I look forward to it.
All right. So,
Um,
yes. Go ahead.
is there a possibility I can get a link to this to send to my editor?
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. I'll send it to you right after I close everything out tonight.
That's terrific. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, and have a great rest of your evening.
Same to you.
I learned so much. Thank you. Have a good one.
You're welcome.
All right. That was terrific. And like I said, since I was a kid, look at this, I keep sinking down. I gotta get my new chair, you guys. Since I was a kid, I was always looking into that stuff and just took it all in. Tomorrow, be ready. We're gonna do the show at noon. I have a guest that's over in England, and so we're gonna be doing the show at noon. We're shifting back to the paranormal a little bit. Maria Wheatley is gonna be with us, and she's gonna be talking about secrets of Stonehenge. So we're going to get to learn a bunch of stuff about Stonehenge, and she's got some really, really interesting stuff to say. All right. Well, if you like the show, share it with 5 people. If you hated the show, share it with your enemies. Equal opportunity here at California Haunts Radio. We're just trying to get the word out about our little old show, and you guys have done a great job doing that. And let's keep it up. Keep it up. We're almost there. We're almost there at YouTube. We're just really close on everything right now. I'll give you his contact information once again, and I have 3 books listed for him, and so you guys know the title, so you can hop on over to Amazon, pick up your copy of this book. It's a great book. I loved it. Just loved it. But I didn't want to give away everything in the book. See, that's the key. You have to walk on this thin line because you don't want to give away everything because you want people to read the book. So I think we covered it pretty well. So anyway, I will do that, and then I will say goodbye to you guys, and I'll see you guys at noon tomorrow. So here we go. Okay, again, his website is his Amazon author page, so it's Jeffrey Sussman, Sussman. And the book we talked about tonight was Tinseltown Gangsters. And Big Apple Gangsters and Sin City Gangsters. And there's also a couple more that I didn't get listed here, but you get over on the Amazon site, you'll get to see them all. Okay, gang, I'm signing off now. I hope you have a great rest of your evening, or if you're going to bed, have a good night's sleep. I will see you tomorrow back here at noon Pacific with Maria Wheatley. Have a great one, you guys. More buttons. Here we go.